When me and my girl are out on a Friday night and we want to have a good time, we drink Blue Dot Syrah. Ain't that right, baby? Cheers. Mother.
This footage just blew the lid off everything, and even 50 Cent couldn't stay silent.
Never-before-seen footage of Sean Diddy Combs in the days leading up to his arrest in New York last September.
You want to put the stuff in my fanny pack, King?
The exclusive video obtained by Netflix shows Combs debating with his lawyers about strategy.
After Cassie's footage lined up with Netflix's The Reckoning, the fallout around Diddy didn't just grow louder, it turned public in a way no one expected. And when 50 Cent reacted, it became clear this situation had crossed out of private damage control.
What was he intending to use it for?
I have no idea what he was doing that for.
I mean, you know, you're talking about a man who films himself doing everything and has for decades. I think he wanted someone to be behind the...
And into open exposure. This isn't celebrity gossip. This isn't clout chasing. This is a public response to evidence changing how the Diddy case is being understood in real time. And once you understand why 50 Cent reacted the way he did, you'll see how deep this fallout actually runs.
Because Diddy is so hated by 50 Cent that apparently a decade ago, 50 Cent just started gathering information on Diddy. As much as he could find. And he started working on a documentary series on how bad Diddy is.
Before we go any further, I want your honest take. Do you think 50 Cent spoke out because the evidence finally forced the issue? Or was this reaction always coming once Cassie's footage surfaced? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want evidence-focused breakdowns that go deeper than headlines, subscribe to the Hidden Evidence now. For a long time, the Diddy situation existed inside controlled spaces. Legal language stayed careful, industry voices stayed quiet. Even when accusations surfaced, responses were measured. But Cassie's footage changed that balance. It removed insulation. Once Cassie's footage connected directly to The Reckoning, the story stopped being theoretical. It became visual, sequential, and difficult to dismiss. And when something reaches that point, people who stayed silent suddenly reassess their position. That's where 50 Cent enters the picture. 50 Cent is not known for vague reactions. When he speaks publicly about situations like this, it's rarely accidental. His reaction wasn't emotional noise, it was timed. In timing matters. The reaction came after Cassie's footage had already begun reshaping how the case was being discussed. That's not coincidence. When someone like 50 Cent reacts publicly, it signals that the internal conversation has already shifted. Public reactions often trail private conclusions. By the time a response becomes visible, alignment has already happened behind the scenes. This is why his reaction landed so heavily. Cassie's footage didn't just add information, it clarified structure. It aligned movement, proximity, and sequence in a way written statements never could. Once that alignment existed, the risk calculus changed. Not just for Diddy's legal team, but for anyone publicly associated with the narrative. Public silence became riskier than commentary. That's a dangerous moment, because when silence breaks, it usually means the story has reached a point where denial no longer protects reputations. 50 Cent's reaction wasn't framed as speculation. It was framed as recognition that the fallout was no longer containable. Containment failed the moment Cassie's footage connected to The Reckoning. This connection mattered because the documentary didn't introduce random allegations. It organized existing ones, and Cassie's footage slid directly into that organization. It didn't contradict anything. It reinforced it. Reinforcement is what triggers reassessment. Reassessment is what triggers reaction. Another reason 50 Cent's response carried weight is credibility. He's not reacting as an outsider guessing. He's reacting as someone deeply familiar with how industry narratives collapse once evidence reaches a certain threshold. He's seen it before. That experience shapes tone. His reaction wasn't exaggerated. It wasn't theatrical. It was pointed. And pointed reactions usually reflect certainty, not curiosity. Certainty comes from alignment, from seeing how separate pieces suddenly fit together. Cassie's footage created that fit. This is also where the story shifts from legal framing to cultural consequence. When public figures react, they're not weighing court outcomes, they're weighing perception, legacy, and association. And those calculations often change faster than legal ones. Once Cassie's footage surfaced, association with Diddy became riskier, not because of rumors, but because of structure. The structure of the story hardened. And hardened stories don't soften easily. That's why 50 Cent's reaction didn't feel spontaneous. It felt inevitable. Another overlooked detail is how the reaction reframed the narrative for viewers. Suddenly, this wasn't just Cassie versus Diddy in a legal sense. It became Cassie's footage triggering industry-level acknowledgement that something had shifted. Acknowledgement is powerful, because acknowledgement removes plausible deniability. Once people acknowledge a shift, they implicitly accept that earlier framing no longer holds. That acceptance spreads, quietly but quickly. This is how fallout accelerates. It doesn't explode all at once, it cascades. Cassie's footage was the first domino. The reckoning set the context. 50 Cent's reaction confirmed the impact. And confirmation is what locks a narrative into place. Once locked, the story stops asking if and starts asking how far. How far will the fallout go? How many voices stayed quiet until now? How many reactions are still waiting behind closed doors? These questions are what keep viewers watching, because the most important part of this story isn't what's already visible, it's what visibility is about to trigger next. And history shows that once industry reactions start, they rarely stop at one voice. They spread, and that spread is already underway. Once 50 Cent's reaction entered the conversation, the dynamic around Diddy shifted again, not louder, but sharper. This wasn't just another voice reacting online. It was a signal that the story had crossed a threshold where silence was no longer the safest option. That matters more than people realize. Public reactions from figures like 50 Cent don't usually come from impulse. They come from assessment, from watching how evidence is landing, from seeing which way the narrative is moving before it becomes irreversible. And by the time Cassie's footage had fully aligned with the reckoning, that direction was becoming clear. What Cassie's footage did was remove ambiguity. It didn't introduce chaos. It created order. It showed sequence. It showed proximity. It showed repetition. And repetition is what transforms accusations into patterns. Patterns are what make people react. For years, the Diddy situation existed inside fragmented spaces. Allegations were discussed separately. Responses were compartmentalized. Everyone could claim distance. Cassie's footage collapsed that distance. It connected moments that were once treated as unrelated. And once those moments connected, the story stopped being defensible in the same way. That's when reactions like 50 Cent's become inevitable. Another reason his response landed so hard is context. 50 Cent has built a reputation on calling out industry behavior once it becomes unsustainable to ignore. He doesn't step in when stories are still fluid. He steps in when outcomes start forming. That timing sends a message. The message wasn't just about Diddy, it was about acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that Cassie's footage changed the risk landscape. Acknowledgement that the reckoning reframed the narrative in a way that stuck. And acknowledgement that defending the old framing now carried reputational cost. That's a powerful shift. Because when reputational cost rises, people reassess their positions quickly. Silence stops being neutral. Neutrality starts looking like avoidance, and avoidance draws attention. This is how fallout accelerates. Cassie's footage didn't just affect legal interpretation, it affected cultural alignment. People who once felt comfortable staying quiet suddenly had to consider what that silence implied. 50 Cent's reaction made that implication visible. Visibility is contagious. Once one high-profile voice reacts, others start reassessing whether staying quiet still protects them. That reassessment happens privately at first. Conversations shift behind closed doors. But eventually some of those shifts become public. That's the phase this story's entering. Another important detail is how 50 Cent's reaction reframed the footage itself. It wasn't framed as rumor. It wasn't framed as speculation. It was framed as confirmation. And confirmation is far more dangerous than accusation. Accusations can be debated. Confirmation forces response. Cassie's footage became confirmation because it aligned so cleanly with what the reckoning laid out. It didn't feel edited to persuade. It felt placed to clarify. And clarity removes the space where alternative explanations survive. That's when reactions stop being optional. It's also worth noting how the tone around Diddy changed immediately after this alignment. Language shifted from alleged to re-examined, from claims to patterns. Those shifts may seem subtle, but they signal a deeper recalibration. Recalibration happens when people sense that the story is settling into a structure that won't easily be undone. That's what 50 Cent reacted to. He wasn't reacting to a single clip. He was reacting to convergence. Cassie's footage, the documentary framing, the timing, the silence around counter-narratives. All of it converged into a moment where the old defenses no longer felt viable. Once defenses feel weak, reactions feel safer. And that's the paradox here. As risk increases for Diddy, it decreases for those willing to speak. When a story gains structure, the cost of speaking drops. When a story is chaotic, speaking is dangerous. Cassie's footage stabilized the narrative. Stability invites commentary. This is why the fallout now feels different from earlier waves of attention. Earlier waves spiked and faded. This one settled. It didn't burn out, it hardened. And hardened narratives don't disappear. Another layer to this is how public reaction feeds institutional attention. Courts don't move because celebrities react. But celebrity reactions often reflect broader interpretive shifts that institutions are already aware of. They're symptoms, not causes. 50 Cent's reaction was a symptom that the internal conversation had already changed. That's also why attempts to dismiss his response as just entertainment miss the point. The reaction wasn't the story, it was the indicator. It showed that the story had reached a stage where even public figures felt comfortable acknowledging its direction. Direction matters more than destination. Once direction is clear, momentum follows. Cassie's footage gave direction. The reckoning provided context. 50 Cent's reaction confirmed impact. And confirmation is what locks audience attention. Because viewers aren't just watching what happened. They're watching what's unfolding next. Who reacts? Who stays quiet? Who shifts tone? Those movements are part of the story now. And that's why retention stays high. Every reaction creates anticipation for the next one. Every silence creates suspicion. Every shift in language becomes meaningful. This isn't just a case anymore. It's a cascade. A cascade triggered by footage that connected dots too cleanly to ignore. As this continues, the most important developments won't always be loud. They'll be subtle. Changes in who speaks. Changes in how things are framed. Changes in what's no longer denied. Those are the signs that matter. And they're already appearing. Cassie's footage didn't just change the narrative around Diddy. It changed how people position themselves around it. And once positioning starts to shift, outcomes begin to take shape quietly, but decisively. That's the phase we're in now. Not the phase of shock, not the phase of outrage, the phase of alignment. And alignment is where consequences begin to crystallize. As the alignment hardened, the conversation around Diddy moved into territory that's far more dangerous than public backlash, institutional memory. This is the stage where narratives stop being debated and start being recorded. Not in headlines, but in frameworks, in how the story is internally categorized, in how future decisions will reference this moment as a turning point rather than an anomaly. That shift is subtle, but it's irreversible. Cassie's footage, combined with the reckoning and reinforced by reactions like 50 Cent's, created something the case previously lacked. Continuity that feels complete. Not exhaustive, but complete enough to justify reevaluation without appearing reactionary. And once reevaluation becomes justifiable, restraint becomes risky. That's the pressure point. Up until this moment, defenders could rely on fragmentation. Separate the footage from the testimony. Separate the testimony from the documentary. Separate public reaction from legal process. That separation allowed for plausible deniability, but once those elements merged into a single interpretive structure, deniability lost its footing. What replaced it was assessment. Assessment is colder than outrage. It doesn't spike and fade. It sits, it revisits, it compares. And most importantly, it asks whether earlier conclusions still make sense under fuller understanding. That question is now unavoidable in Diddy's case. Another important development in this phase is how Cassie's role is being reframed not as an accuser, but as a reference point. Her experience is no longer treated as one narrative among many. It's being used as a measuring tool, how events are evaluated, how proximity is understood, how influence is interpreted over time. That's a major escalation. When one person's experience becomes a lens through which a case is understood, it signals that the system has identified coherence, and coherence changes how responsibility is distributed. This is also where power dynamics move to the center of analysis. Not power as image, but power as structure. Who controlled space? Who had access? Who adapted their behavior? Cassie's footage doesn't argue these points, it displays them. Quietly, repeatedly. And repetition is what makes systems visible. Earlier defenses leaned on the idea that moments were isolated or misinterpreted, but once repetition is established, isolation collapses. What once looked situational begins to look environmental, and environments carry different levels of accountability. That's when severity calculations change. This is why the fallout around Diddy feels heavier now. Not louder, heavier. The noise has decreased, but the weight has increased. Fewer people are speculating. More people are observing. Observation is what precedes formal consequence. Another factor accelerating this phase is the absence of effective counterframing. There has been no strong alternative narrative that recontextualizes Cassie's footage in a way that weakens its alignment with the reckoning. Silence doesn't prove anything, but in analysis, silence narrows options. Narrowed options raise probability, and probability is what sentencing frameworks respond to. This is also where reactions like 50 Cent's take on additional meaning, not as provocations, but as indicators that the story has passed a credibility threshold. When influential figures respond without hedging, it suggests confidence that the narrative won't reverse. People don't risk that confidence lightly. At this stage, even those who remain silent are participating in the story. Silence becomes a position, a calculated one. And calculated silence often suggests that outcomes are being anticipated rather than resisted. That anticipation is dangerous for Diddy, because anticipation changes behavior. Legal posture tightens, messaging becomes cautious, engagement drops. These aren't signs of chaos, they're signs of preparation for consequence. Another overlooked aspect of this phase is how the case is now being discussed among professionals. Language has shifted. Analysts aren't asking whether Cassie's account is believable. They're asking how it fits within documented structure. That's a profound change. Believability is subjective. Fit is analytical. Once a narrative fits, it becomes part of the system's internal logic. And internal logic doesn't need public validation to operate. This is where the reckoning continues to exert influence. Not because it persuades emotionally, but because it organizes information in a way that aligns with formal review processes. It presented Cassie's experience as sequence rather than shock. That sequencing made integration possible. Integration is what courts and institutions rely on. And once integration occurs, revisiting becomes mandatory. Another reason this phase is so consequential is precedent awareness. Institutions don't only decide cases, they decide how they'll be remembered. They are acutely aware of moments in history where early restraint was later criticized as failure to act. That awareness doesn't push them toward severity automatically, but it does push them toward completeness. Completeness is what this case is moving toward. Cassie's footage didn't complete the story on its own, but it removed the last excuse for incompleteness. It showed that existing material could be understood more fully if viewed together. And once that possibility exists, ignoring it becomes indefensible. That's when doors reopen. This is also why the life sentence discussion feels different this time. It's not being floated as a threat. It's being treated as a recalibrated ceiling. A ceiling that must be acknowledged because the variables beneath it have changed. Change variables demand new outcomes. Those variables include duration, normalization, control, and sustained access. Cassie's footage intersects with all of them. And when variables shift, frameworks must adjust. Framework adjustment is procedural, not emotional. That's why this phase feels quiet. Quiet phases are where frameworks solidify. Loud phases test reaction. Quiet phases determine resolution. We're in the quiet phase now. And in quiet phases, every small movement matters. Who speaks? Who doesn't? What language is used? What assumptions disappear? Those shifts are the story now. This is why retention remains high for viewers. They're not watching for a reveal. They're watching for confirmation of direction, for signs that the alignment is holding, for clues about what comes next. Because when alignment holds, escalation becomes likely. Cassie's footage held. The reckoning held. The reactions held. Nothing collapsed. That stability is what signals danger for Diddy. Not danger from public outrage, but danger from institutional momentum. Momentum that doesn't require headlines to function. Momentum that moves through review, reassessment, and quiet recalibration. Once momentum reaches that stage, it doesn't reverse easily. And that's where the story now sits. Not at the beginning, not at the end, but in the narrow corridor where understanding has solidified and consequences are being shaped to match it. By the time a case reaches this stage, outcomes are no longer driven by reaction, they're driven by alignment. Alignment between what's visible, what's documented, and what institutions are prepared to stand behind long term. That's exactly where the Diddy situation now sits. Cassie's footage didn't force a conclusion, it forced coherence. And coherence is the one thing systems cannot ignore. What's happening now is not about discovery, it's about absorption. Cassie's footage has been absorbed into the broader understanding shaped by the reckoning. The reactions, including 50 Cent's, have been absorbed into how the fallout is publicly contextualized. And together they've created a version of events that no longer feels fragmented or provisional. It feels settled, not settled in outcome, but settled in logic. Once logic settles, decisions stop being speculative. They become procedural. Every institution involved begins asking the same question from different angles. Does the response match the understanding we now have? And if it doesn't, adjustment becomes inevitable. That's why this phase feels heavier than anything that came before. Earlier phases were loud. Allegations surged. Attention spiked. Then things cooled. This phase is different. It's quieter, but far more consequential. Quiet phases are where reputations stop being debated and start being archived, where cases stop being argued in public and start being positioned for history. That's the real danger zone. Cassie's role in this process is no longer peripheral. Cassie is no longer referenced as one voice among many. Cassie's experience has become the backbone around which interpretation now forms. Her consistency, her proximity, her documentation. All of it has been integrated into a single structure. Structures don't bend easily, and once a structure forms, everything else is measured against it. For Diddy, this means the margin for reinterpretation has collapsed. Arguments that relied on distance in time, distance in context, distance in framing no longer operate the same way. Cassie's footage eliminated that distance. The reckoning explained it, and public reactions confirmed that others see the same alignment. That triangulation is what matters. When documentation, narrative framing, and independent reaction all point in the same direction, the system doesn't need new information to move forward. It needs justification, and justification now exists. This is also where the life sentence discussion becomes unavoidable, not as a prediction, but as a boundary marker. Sentencing frameworks are designed to scale with severity as it is understood at the time of decision. Severity isn't measured by how shocking something feels. It's measured by duration, normalization, control, and sustained impact. Cassie's footage intersects with all of those variables. Duration, by showing continuity rather than moments. Normalization, by revealing routine rather than exception. Control, by clarifying access and environment. Impact, by aligning with consistent testimony over time. Once those variables are recalculated, the ceiling must be acknowledged even if the final outcome never reaches it. Acknowledgement alone changes leverage, posture, and expectation. That's why the fallout now feels final in a way it didn't before. Not final in verdict, but final in direction. Another sign of this is how the language around the case has stabilized. Early on, terminology shifted constantly. Allegations, claims, disputes. Now the language is steadier. Analysts talk about patterns, frameworks, reassessment. Those words signal that the conversation has moved from uncertainty to evaluation. Evaluation is where consequences are shaped. And evaluation doesn't care about fatigue. It doesn't care about trending cycles. It doesn't care whether attention rises or falls. Once evaluation begins, it proceeds until alignment is achieved. This is why the case hasn't faded. It didn't peak and disappear. It transitioned. The presence of figures like 50 Cent in this phase isn't about spectacle. It's about confirmation. Confirmation that the story has reached a point where acknowledging its direction is safer than pretending it's still unresolved. People don't step into that space unless they believe the ground has stabilized. Stability is dangerous for anyone hoping for reversal. As this process continues, the most important developments won't necessarily be public. They'll occur through quiet recalibration, through internal review, through decisions framed not as reaction, but as responsibility. That's how systems protect their credibility. Credibility doesn't come from perfection. It comes from adaptability, from the ability to say, with clearer understanding, we reassessed. Cassie's footage forced that clarity. The reckoning made it interpretable, and the reactions made it undeniable. There's no going back to fragmentation now. Fragmentation was the last shield. Separation between moments, separation between narratives, separation between consequence and accountability. Integration removed that shield. Once integration happens, outcomes must follow. Not dramatically, not immediately, but decisively. This is why the story now feels complete even though it isn't finished. Completion of understanding always comes before completion of process. And understanding has reached its threshold. Whatever the final outcome is, it will not be framed as surprise. It will be framed as alignment. Alignment between what was known, what is now understood, and what responsibility demands under that understanding. That's the legacy this case is moving toward. Not a headline, not a viral moment, but a reference point. A reference point for how footage reframed narrative, how narrative reshaped interpretation, and how interpretation recalibrated consequence. If you followed this breakdown from start to finish, I want to hear your take. Do you believe Cassie's footage combined with the reckoning and reactions like 50 Cent's permanently changed the direction of the Diddy case? Or was this fallout inevitable once everything finally aligned? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want deep, evidence-driven analysis that follows stories beyond the headlines and into the decisions that actually matter, subscribe to The Hidden Evidence. More breakdowns are coming, and the most important truths are always the ones that surface last.